As the patient was recovering in the hospital, strange things began to happen. They would hear strange whispers in the middle of the night, and the room would become extremely cold, despite the warm summer weather outside. The patient began to feel like they were being watched, but every time they looked around, no one was there. One night, the patient woke up to find a figure standing at the end of their bed. It was a tall, dark figure with glowing red eyes, and it seemed to be staring right at them. The patient tried to scream, but no sound would come out. They were frozen in terror. The figure began to move closer and closer until it was standing right next to the patient's bed. It reached out a hand and touched the patient's forehead. Suddenly, the patient's mind was flooded with images of the hospital's dark past. They saw doctors performing horrific experiments on patients and the spirits of those who had died in the hospital roaming the halls. The patient realized that they were not alone in the hospital room and that the figure was not there to harm them. It was a spirit trying to communicate a message. The patient listened carefully and heard the spirit say, "Beware the doctor with the scalpel. He will not stop until he has claimed his next victim." The patient knew they had to get out of the hospital, but they were too weak to move. They closed their eyes and hoped that when they opened them again, the figure would be gone. When they opened their eyes, the figure had vanished. The patient called for the nurse and told them they needed to leave the hospital immediately. The patient never forgot the warning they had received from the spirit in the hospital. They did some research and discovered that a doctor who had worked at the hospital many years ago had a reputation for being overly aggressive with his patients. His nickname was the Scalpel, and he had been fired from the hospital after several patients died under his care. The patient was grateful for the warning and made a full recovery after leaving the hospital. But they could never forget the feeling of being watched and the chilling message from beyond the grave. Months had passed since the incident at the hospital, and the patient had tried to put the experience behind them, but as much as they tried, they couldn't shake off the feeling that something was following them. Every night they felt as though they were being watched, even when they were alone. The patient's family and friends grew increasingly concerned as they noticed their loved ones' deteriorating mental state. They started to withdraw from social activities and stopped going out altogether. They were convinced that whatever had been haunting them in the hospital had followed them home. One night, as the patient was lying in bed, they heard a faint whispering. It was almost inaudible, but the patient could make out a voice saying, "I'm still here." Trembling with fear, the patient turned on the light, but there was no one there. However, when they looked in the mirror, they saw a figure standing behind them. It was the ghostly apparition of a woman, her face twisted in a grotesque expression. The patient's screams woke up their family, but when they arrived in the room, they saw nothing but their loved one, alone and terrified. But the patient knew what they had seen, and the ghostly figure haunted their dreams every night thereafter. Eventually, the patient was unable to cope with the terror and was admitted back to the hospital. They tried to explain what had happened, but the doctors dismissed it as a hallucination. But the patient knew the truth, and they were convinced that the ghostly woman was. Despite their best efforts to move on from the haunting, the patient found themselves constantly looking over their shoulder and feeling a sense of dread whenever they were alone. They tried to convince themselves that it was all in their head, but they knew deep down that the ghostly woman was still with them. As the days turned into weeks, the patient's mental and emotional state began to deteriorate. They struggled to sleep at night, and their work performance suffered. They even started to see the ghostly woman in their dreams, beckoning them to return to the hospital. One night, while lying in bed, the patient heard a faint whisper in their ear. It was the same eerie voice that had warned them about the ghostly woman. "She's still here," the voice said, "and she won't leave until you join her." Terrified, the patient jumped out of bed and searched their room, but there was no one there. They knew they had to do something to put an end to the haunting once and for all. Desperate for answers, the patient returned to the hospital and searched through the archives to find any information on the ghostly woman. That's when they discovered a shocking truth. The woman had been a patient at the hospital years ago and had died under mysterious circumstances. Determined to put the ghostly woman to rest, the patient began to conduct their own investigation. They visited the woman's grave and performed a ritual to help her move on. And finally, after months of being haunted, the patient felt a sense of peace. But even though the ghostly woman was gone, the patient could never forget the terror she had inflicted upon them. They knew that the hospital would never be a safe place for them again, and that the memory of the haunting would haunt them for the rest of their days. The patient tried to move on from the experience, but the trauma had left a lasting impact. They struggled with nightmares and constant anxiety, always feeling like someone or something was watching them. They couldn't bear to be alone, and would often leave the TV on all night to drown out the silence. One day, the patient received an unexpected package in the mail. It was a small, old-fashioned music box with intricate carvings on the outside. As soon as they opened it, the haunting melody of a lullaby filled the room. At first, the patient thought it was a kind gesture from a friend or family member, but as the days went on, they began to notice something strange. Every time they opened the music box, the ghostly presence of the woman seemed to return. The patient could feel her cold breath on their neck and her voice whispering in their ear. Terrified, the patient tried to get rid of the music box, but it kept reappearing on their doorstep no matter how many times they threw it away. Eventually, they realized that the only way to break the curse was to find out the truth behind the haunting. The patient went on a quest to uncover the history of the hospital and the ghostly woman. They spent hours poring over old records and speaking to former staff members until they finally stumbled upon a shocking discovery. The woman haunting the hospital was not a patient at all, but a nurse who had worked there in the 1950s. She had been falsely accused of harming a patient and had been driven to suicide by the false accusations and the guilt she felt for not being able to save the patient's life. With this knowledge, the patient was able to confront the ghostly woman and offer her the closure she had been seeking for all these years. The music box stopped playing and the ghostly presence vanished for good. Though the patient was relieved to finally be free of the haunting, the experience had changed them forever. They now knew that the line between life and death was much thinner than they had ever imagined, and that the past could come back to haunt you in ways you never expected. In the weeks that followed, the patients struggled to regain their sense of normalcy. They found it hard to sleep, haunted by nightmares and the feeling of being watched. They avoided hospitals at all costs, and even began to feel uneasy in other medical settings. Despite their efforts to move on, the patient couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. They would catch glimpses of a woman in white out of the corner of their eye, and they could hear her whispering in the darkness. It seemed that the ghostly presence was still with them, even outside the hospital walls. As time went on, the patient's mental state deteriorated. They became increasingly paranoid and agitated, and their behavior began to worry those around them. Friends and family tried to intervene, but the patient was convinced that the ghostly woman was still haunting them and refused to seek help. One night, the patient disappeared without a trace. Despite an extensive search, no trace of them was ever found. It was as if they had vanished into thin air, leaving only the memory of their haunting experience behind. Some say that the patient was consumed by the ghostly woman, that she had finally claimed her victim. Others believe that the patient was driven to madness by the experience and took their own life. But regardless of what happened, the memory of the hospital haunting lived on, a chilling reminder of the thin line between life and death, and the lasting impact of the supernatural on the human psyche.